Hello. If I were to describe to you a scene that features a fading in to a scrolling panoramic of a city at night, with the glow of undulating traffic beneath moonlit skyscrapers, and an atmospheric techno beat that kicks in over an introductory scrolling body of text, you may be forgiven for thinking I'm talking about a Hollywood movie. However, I am of course talking about the introduction to 1991's Streets of Rage. Now, Streets of Rage is, without a doubt, one of the most poignant memories I have from childhood. And I mean, just taking this introduction on its own, I'm sure without even, kind of watching it and seeing it, those of you that played this game and had this game probably remember what I'm talking about, particularly the profound soundtrack provided by Yuzo Koshiro. It's absolutely fantastic, the introductory music, and indeed the music throughout, the course of this game. So, you may be forgiven for thinking that, when I say this is one of the best gaming experiences I've ever had, I'm slipping into nostalgia and I'm really looking at this game through, rose-tinted glasses. Indeed, I've kind of spoken to friends, frequently about this game. In fact, it's surprising how often this game gets brought up when one talks about video games from childhood. And they all sort of turn around and they're like, no, yeah, but it's crap by today's standards, or, something like that. And I couldn't disagree more. And the reason that I've opted to take this foray into talking about Streets of Rage today is actually that I'm in the process of moving house, and I found my Sega Mega Drive, my Sega Genesis, up in the attic, and so I've dug it out and plugged it in, and as you can imagine, I'm playing Streets of Rage constantly. No packing has been done thus far. And I feel compelled to talk about it because it's not simply a facet of nostalgia that makes this game fantastic. It really is a brilliant game, and I've been sat here playing it all morning, and it's great, And okay, I mean, a lot of people argue that the graphics have aged badly, and of course, it's on a 16-bit console. Of course, the graphics have aged, kind of badly, but I think you're kind of you're missing the point if you look at it that way. The format of the game, the actual side-scrolling sort of beat 'em up, is a fantastic genre of game that we simply do not see anymore. And I think that makes Streets of Rage, if anything, kind of relevant today almost, because it's a genre apart from what we now get. And I think that if people want these sort of gaming experiences, they do perhaps have to turn to these sort of old school consoles to kind of get a glimmer of that. I mean, looking at the game as a whole, and taking into account that it is, a kind of a side-scrolling beat 'em up, it's by no means a original kind of title in this. I mean, Streets of Rage came out in 1991. Prior to this, I was a NES owner, and some of you guys might remember Double Dragon, which came out in 1988, and of course, Golden Axe, which was another Sega game, which came out in 1990. So, these are all kind of games that operate in a similar sort of format. So it's not to say that Streets of Rage was innovative to that respect, but it does have a very distinct uniqueness to it. And I mean, my favourite is the first game, and I know a lot of people love the third one, and of course the second one, because they did flesh out the movesets that the characters can do and the special manoeuvres, but it's right from the off. It's right from the first game that we actually get the atmosphere and the world building of Streets of Rage. Not so much the narrative. I mean, on a narrative note, it's interesting to see that Streets of Rage does have a degree of lineage through the three games, and also an ongoing story arc, which isn't something that these games really warranted. I mean, if we look at Double Dragon's introduction is 5 seconds, and that's the entire narrative of the game, and then you just go through and try and kill a bad guy. Streets of Rage does actually have character storylines, albeit sort of flimsy ones, but it's kind of interesting that there is that angle to it as well. But I think the real thing that set Streets of Rage apart was the atmosphere, the entirety of the game, how it was packaged and delivered. I mean, even the name Streets of Rage is just absolutely brilliant. And if you've I don't know if any of you have done research. When they were concepting this game, it went through some pretty bad names, such as D-Force, I think it was, like Dragon Force, and it was like the name of these kind of cops that tried cleaning up the city and stuff. And it went through some pretty bad concepting stages, but they landed on Streets of Rage, which is absolutely fantastic, and the title is synonymous with exactly what we get in the game. It's got this gritty, even with the 16-bit graphics, you get this sense of a kind of gritty, windblown city. Even when we're kind of playing through the stages, we get trash kind of blowing past. We've of course got Koshiro's fantastic kind of 16-beat, techno house kind of music that he's got in the background, and it's absolutely brilliant. They've completely crystallized this world for us, and there's none of this like jaunty lightness that we get with, for example, Golden Axe, and all of this. Of course, it's to do with elves and mages, but I mean, even the color scheme, the color palette of Golden Axe is really bright, and it's kind of like, but Streets of Rage is very muted, dark color schemes, and it's just absolutely brilliant. It's just absolutely fantastic that they've created that. I think as a whole, it's kind of unfortunate this sort of genre has fallen by the wayside a bit. I mean, they had the 3 games, and then they had the 4th one, which was in motion for the Sony PlayStation. But I think there was an issue with the branding. I think Sega wanted to keep it an exclusive for them, so it ended up getting renamed and becoming Fighting Force. And I don't know if anyone remembers Fighting Force, which came out in 1997, but it was a 3D version of Streets of Rage, pretty much. It was okay. It wasn't. Personally, I don't think it was as good as Streets of Rage. And of course, we lost the characters and we lost the branding, which is, as I've already stated, kind of intrinsic to what Streets of Rage actually is. So, I mean, talking about the actual, branding and how Streets of Rage comes across, I find it actually really quite amusing. And I think it's a Japanese thing. I mean, I'm not entirely sure, but it must be their perception of the West. But Streets of Rage dines out on the oddest stereotypes you can possibly, expect. And, for example, we have Axel, right? And Axel, and the main story arc doesn't even hinge on Axel. It's worth noting that mainly it's about Adam, and then later on, his brother. But, we have on the box, on the front cover, this kind of blonde, Aryan sort of, white dude who's like Axel. And then we have, Blaze, who's like the obligatory, woman who's very, gymnastic-y. And then, of course, we have, the black dude who is Adam, who's the boxer. And it's like, I just find it really amusing that, we're kind of operating in these sort of like, racial, but also sort of media stereotypes, if you like, as well. And, taking these stereotypes and opening them out to, the bad guys that we encounter all throughout this game. I mean, for example, we have the standard punk sort of antagonist who, has an orange flat top and, these and a cut-off jacket, and, he's wearing kind of cut-off gloves. And, it's just very funny. Of course, they change his colour palette throughout. And then we have, guys with pink mohawks and green and orange mohawks, and these women with whips. And it's very almost not steampunk, but, like kind of cyberpunky sort of antagonist. And it's actually quite interesting because, I mean, I said this is a kind of perhaps an East and West thing, but not so much. I mean, if we look at films that were coming out in, the throughout the 80s, so for example, Escape from New York, which is a film starring Kurt Russell as Pliskin, who was actually, interestingly, and sort of going off on a tangent a bit, was actually the inspiration for Solid Snake in Metal Gear Solid. But if you look at the bad guys in that film, these kind of these criminals that are kind of inhabiting, New York City, which has been partitioned off as a area where the criminals are. It's like they all have, these big spiky hairs, and they wear a lot of leather. And, and Mad Max as well is another prime example of, how these bad guys are perceived. And it's almost like, you can come away from this, growing up in this period like I did. It's no wonder we were thinking that, gangs in New York must have been these kind of leather-clad, wearing cut-off gloves and, that sort of thing. And again, of course, Jackie Chan movies, if you look at the bad guys in that, very stereotypical. You've got the Chinese guy who comes along who's a thug, but also, of course, he's brilliant at, kung fu. And then you have, these white guys with spiky hair who are like boxers and stuff. And it's just funny that, kind of Streets of Rage has taken this pop culture sort of idea of, the gritty New York criminal, the underworld. And implicated it in the game. So, looking at it from this angle with the gender and the racial stereotypes of, the protagonists, almost kind of accounting for each one because, they should be there almost sort of thing. And then, having these bad guys that are very much lifted out of, the Hollywood aesthetic of films, of that time. We can see Streets of Rage operating as a piece of cultural history and an artifact of cultural history, crystallizing that period of time, as much as it is a piece of, gaming history as well. So it's much more than just a piece of a gaming memorabilia, if you like. Moving on to the gameplay of Streets of Rage, it's very simplistic, but I think that is actually what's in its favour. We have the introduction, we have the scrolling monologue of the introduction, and then it's all the rounds, and then you have a bit of dialogue, towards the end, and that's basically the narrative. The actual brilliance of this game is the actual, going through the rounds, particularly especially two-player, of course, because and one of the reasons, digressing slightly, one of the reasons I absolutely love this game so much is it's interactive. You can play it two-player, but it's one of the few games where the screen isn't a split screen sort of thing. If you're playing, Call of Duty natively, or you're playing, Mario Kart or anything like that, the screen gets partitioned up. And although, that's just the nature of things, it's so nice to have an interactive experience with someone on the same screen. You're completely immersed in the same environment with another person, which is, brilliant. But aside from this, it's very basic. You have C to jump, you have B, which does combos, you can get close and do grappling maneuvers, and then you have A, which is the special button which calls, the cop to kind of come and do a special attack on bad guys if you're getting swamped or on a boss or whatever. So, very simplistic, but it shows that, you don't need, figurative realism, you don't need, fantastic graphics. I'm playing Assassin's Creed 2. I've just completed the first one. I'm actually working my way through, the Assassin's Creed games because I wanted to know what all the fuss was about, and I've never actually touched them until now. I've actually and Assassin's Creed 2 is a fantastic game, I might add. It's really quite immersive. It's much more fun than the first one. But I've actually kind of put it aside, and I'm just playing Streets of Rage constantly. So it goes to show you don't need these fantastic graphics and all these free-roaming elements and all these narrative twists and turns and depth to sort of have a fantastic gaming experience. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's much nicer just to be able to pick up a game and play it, and just play through, and it's just, it's just really fun and very intuitive as well. It's not one of these games like, you've got your Skyrims and your Final Fantasies and all these games, where you kind of need, to learn the battle system, for example, and things like that, and learn how to craft things, or all of that is just stripped back, and it's just like, no, you just pick up and you sort of play it, and like a 5-year-old could get it. And I like that, and I think there's something important about that. And funnily enough, I was talking to my housemate this morning before he went to work, because I was playing it, at 7:30 this morning when he was getting up to go to work. But we were talking about, the idea of video games as art. And if you've watched any of my other videos, to do with Tekken or Final Fantasy, you'll know that this is something I'm concerned with. I do see video games as a art form. And we were talking about, does it necessarily need to be figuratively artistic and brilliant, and does it need narrative depth and complexity, like, for example, Final Fantasy VIII, which is one of my favourite games ever? Does it necessarily need that to be art form? And we sort of kind of came up with this notion that there are two types of game. There are the Final Fantasies where it's like a roller coaster of narrative, and then there are the Streets of Rage sort of games where you pick it up and you just play it. So it's really quite interesting to see how video games kind of branch off from one another like that. And to this day, I'm still mulling it over, because I find Streets of Rage fantastic, and I think in a lot of ways I can't help but see it as a work of art in a way, and an artifact as well. This piece of it, as I've said before, it kind of crystallizes this moment in gaming and cultural history. As much as cinema does. And, of course we have cinematic historians, and I think very soon we will be having video game historians as well. In fact, almost certainly we should be, because I think they can mirror they can mirror culture, if anything, as much, if not more, than movies, literature, and music can. So yeah, I mean, this was a very brief talk. I just, because I picked up Streets of Rage and I've been playing it, and I really wanted to just kind of, get this off my chest, because I think as time goes on, it will become more obscure, this game, and I think it's worth kind of noting it. You can probably play it online. There's probably an emulator, so I'd certainly recommend giving it a go if you haven't tried it before. If anything, just listen to the soundtrack. If you listen to the soundtrack, it will kind of really I think it will really quite draw you in and engage you if you can get around the limited technology that they had around that time. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all I have to say about Streets of Rage.